All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this installment of our In Conversation series. My name is Sarah White. I am the Community Engagement Coordinator with the Northampton County Historical and Genealogical Society, as we call NCHGS. Our mission here at the Society is to share the stories of Northampton County's past to encourage personal reflection, community dialogue, and an understanding of history's impact on our lives. It is our vision that through exploring local history, we will foster a more caring, respectful, and inclusive community. We encourage you to become a member of NCHGS if you are not already. I know we have some members here with us tonight, where you can receive invitations to opening receptions, free museum admission, and access to our research library. You can find more information on membership, programs, events, and our exhibits at sigelmuseum.org. We will have a question and answer period following the conversation tonight, so please feel free to use the chat feature at the bottom of the screen. We will respond to as many as our time allows. Tonight, we are in conversation with Dr. Andrea Lynn Smith, an historical anthropologist exploring settler colonialism, memory and forgetting, and place loss. Dr. Smith's new book, Memory Wars, Settlers and Natives Remember Washington's Sullivan Expedition of 1779, contrasts the official story of a Revolutionary War expedition with that told by Seneca and other Native American leaders at Haudenosaunee cultural centers. Dr. Smith, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you. It's really wonderful to be here.
Thank you. We're so excited. And I know we've done programs together in the past, and we are back together again. It's always exciting to partner with other community organizations and leaders. Mm-hmm. So let's start off with the very, very basics. Can you tell us what is settler colonialism? And what does it mean to study settler colonialism from your perspective, from that academic perspective?
Okay, we're getting right in there. Well, first of all, welcome everyone, and I'm really so appreciative that you're here listening. So I guess in colonial studies, people often separate out different kinds of colonies. So economic colonies would be those with a small number of colonists. They're there to extract resources, and then they may go home. So an example would be rubber plantations in the Belgian Congo or something. And European powers colonized a lot of Africa in this way. Settler colonies are a little bit different, and their settlement is a primary focus. More people decide to move permanently. So examples would be the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. And you might have noticed those are all colonies with the British origins. So these categories were created later by scholars. And in the real world, a country might morph from one kind of colony to another. But most people do say that settler colonialism is distinct. And it's distinct because the people who come to settle come to stay. They have no intention of going back. And so that means that settler colonialism will set into play a kind of hostile relationship with the place's indigenous societies, because the settlers want the land that the indigenous people are living on. Mm-hmm. And so Native people in the British examples I just mentioned have been subject to similar kinds of violence as the settlers try to settle in these new places. So there might be outright warfare. People might be removed to reserves or reservations. They might be subject to forced assimilation and boarding schools, and so forth. So I'm interested in these similarities, and I'm also interested in the cultural consequences of settler colonialism, and especially the consequences for the settlers. Are there patterns in countries that have settler colonial origins? Do settlers, or the dominant group, have similar features from one country to the next? Do they share certain ways of understanding their past? So that's kind of what it means to study this from an academic context. Yeah.
Yeah, we just jumped right in there with the heavy hitting questions.
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Hope you're comfortable.
Yeah. Oh, here, I'll distract you for a minute. This is a picture of the book. I don't know if you can see. So this is what we eventually will be getting to in just a minute. Anyway.
Some light reading. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that is sort of related to settler colonialism, but can also be a standalone subject, you also study memory and forgetting, and specifically through the lens of place loss. Do you prefer to study those in tandem with one another? Do you study them separately? What does it mean for you in your field to also study those as well?
Okay, well, that's a great question too. I'm interested in collective memory. So the kinds of stories that bind a group of people together, the shared stories. And I'm also interested in their political uses of these stories.
Mhm.
So a lot of my previous publications have looked at how hidden stories have been silenced, or how stories have been rewritten by dominant groups for different reasons. And so in this book, I'm trying to understand how dominant people in a settler colony narrate their past. Like, what are the features of what I call a settler colonial historical consciousness, or you could say a settler memory? How do settlers tell their story? What stories do they leave out and why? So as an anthropologist doing this, I'm also listening to how people narrate their past, and what do they emphasize? What do they repeat? What do they ignore? And then what gets written down in written sources, in historical markers? Who are the protagonists? What are the morals? So those are all kind of memory kinds of questions. But I'm also really interested in the power of place. So memories of place can really unite people over a long period of time. So I did some work on a demolished neighborhood in Easton, the Lebanese neighborhood known as Syrian Town. And I found that people who were from that neighborhood that had been demolished were united by telling stories about the place. So the place itself, even though it wasn't there, was kind of interwoven with their understandings of themselves and their neighbors and so forth. So I think place memories can really unite people for generations, for millennia. And we can see that within a lot of diaspora communities. So that's why I find the memories of place, especially with a group displaced, especially poignant and captivating to study. So that's why I study it.
That is, I would say that sounds wonderful, but that also sounds heartbreaking and
Yeah.
heavy.
Yeah.
A lot of your previous works, I want to introduce them very quickly, and then we'll get into the meat of your new book. Your previous works have focused on the silencing of particularly Native and Latino voices in local history museums in the American Southwest in particular. And also, as you said, the role of place loss in a communal identity in the aftermath of forced removal from the Easton neighborhood, 4th and Lehigh, Lebanese Town. Your newly released book, however, is titled Memory Wars: Settlers and Natives Remember Washington's Sullivan Expedition of 1779. Sullivan's expedition eradicated over 40 villages of the Haudenosaunee, and understandably, it was seen very differently through the Haudenosaunee and the colonist perspectives. In examining why Americans fix a historical narrative to land and to place, you also examine the consequences of doing so. Can you give us a brief overview of what the Sullivan Expedition was, what its intended purpose was, and how we remember it? And then we'll get into like the meat of the book itself.
Okay. Yeah. So this was a very long expedition in the Revolutionary War. It started in Easton in mid-June 1779 and went on until October of 1779. And it was directed against the Iroquois Confederacy, now known today as the Haudenosaunee. So that was 6 nations: the Cayuga, the Seneca, the Mohawk, the Onondagas, the Oneidas, and the Tuscaroras. So the Iroquois Confederacy was then based in central New York during the, at the time of the Revolutionary War. And they were dangerously positioned between the British and the Patriots, as the conflict is starting to develop, and they tried to remain neutral. But finally, they found themselves having to take part in the fighting midway. And so this Revolutionary War kind of split them apart for a while. During the Revolutionary War, also, some of the Seneca, Cayuga, Mohawk started to align with the British And they formed this guerrilla group, the Butler's Rangers, that involved British Tories and these warriors. And the unit had incredible successes, notably at the Battle of Wyoming in 1778. So that was up near Wilkes-Barre. After that attack and a few more frontier attacks, Congress was really worried and ordered George Washington to protect the frontiers better. It was hard for one to raise troops, as people wanted to stay behind and protect their families. So Washington spent months planning this very long campaign, and it had many different prongs to it. It was designed to chastise, Washington wrote, and terrify the members of the Confederacy. And he directed almost a third of the Continental Army to this task, so about 4,000 men, hundreds of boats, pack horses, cattle. And Sullivan's brigades assembled in Easton, and there was another group up in Canajoharie under General Clinton. They met up in Athens, Pennsylvania, and from there, their mission was to destroy every single Native American settlement, as you said, and all their stored food. So Washington ordered Sullivan to prevent them from planting more crops as well. The idea was they were a breadbasket for the British troops. But he also really, I think, was hoping to get the Haudenosaunee to capitulate and to maybe even join the Patriots and help them attack the British at Niagara. It actually backfired. But anyway, so the troops spent 4 months doing this, traveling from Easton up into central New York, destroying villages. There were not that many person-to-person conflicts. There was just one kind of battle between forces, because the Haudenosaunee practice was to evacuate the villages to prevent the loss of civilian life. So they would flee right before the troops arrived, and then it wasn't hard to tell they were coming because there were, blowing bugles, and there was just cannons and all sorts of noise. The Haudenosaunee lost their known world. So for them, it was devastating. Most fled north to the British fort at Niagara, and lots died of starvation that winter. So that's the Sullivan Expedition. I find it interesting, given that background, that it was so documented on the land. And so I started to research this because there are some markers in Easton, and I soon found that there are markers all the way up a road known as Sullivan Trail up into New York, and there are about 60 markers in Pennsylvania, and about 200 or more in New York. And so because these are separate initiatives organized by different people at different times, I call this a Sullivan commemorative complex. It's not really a simple set of markers set up at one time by an overarching agency, but a lot of different projects carried out by different people. And so that's the focus of my book. Really, why do people celebrate this, and how and when?
Right. And it's so interesting to think about how we know it today as Sullivan's Expedition. And we use the word expedition. It's almost like people going on an adventure, right? Which is very much not the case. It's actually kind of horrifyingly destructive. And in terms of how we remember it, is significantly different than how the indigenous peoples of New York especially remember it. And something that I think makes this book, your book, so important and so relevant is that obviously you're relying on historical and archival research. You are a historian, right? But you also rely on first-person contemporary accounts of Native Americans and non-Native Americans that live along this, what we call now Sullivan's Trail. How this event is interpreted at Haudenosaunee cultural centers today. Can you talk about what it was like to work with these and to compile these different and contrasting viewpoints?
Yeah, it was actually really a lot of fun. I started in Pennsylvania and I worked my way north. And I was asking people who lived in the vicinity of the historical markers what they knew about them. So some people in small towns like Tunkhannock or Towanda knew an awful lot. And then they would send me to people who they thought would know more. Mm-hmm. But as I found, there were also quite a few people who would drive by the markers every day and didn't really care about them, didn't know anything about them, and never stopped to read them. So I found a real mix. But then the real sort of diehard really history enthusiasts would know not only about the historical markers, they would have read lots of books about the Sullivan Expedition and also know where every single Revolutionary War burial site is, right? So it was a really interesting mix of people. When I started to travel into New York, I found a different marker history and a different way of telling this story, and also an everyday talk. So what was interesting, I would ask people at these little historical centers, could you tell me about the Sullivan markers and how does that story feature in your understanding of yourself today, or something like that? I would ask the same question in New York, and people would sometimes say, hey, I don't know if that's such a great topic. That isn't something that our Haudenosaunee neighbors really celebrate. So I found that in Pennsylvania, there was a very different sense than in New York. And so I attribute that to the fact that there are these active Haudenosaunee nations in New York really trying to express themselves. So at the Haudenosaunee cultural centers, I think for a lot of people that I met, they didn't really want to talk about this expedition because it was a really terribly sad story, and they wanted to talk about the present instead. So the places I went to, the Seneca Iroquois National Museum in Salamanca, which is right next to a marker, Ganondagan, the Seneca Art and Culture Center, which is up near Rochester, the Oneida Cultural Center, and Scano, the Great Law Peace Center, south of Syracuse. And there I would find a different way of talking about it. So it wasn't called necessarily the Sullivan Expedition. It might be called the Whirlwind or the Holocaust or the Firestorm or something. And then when people would talk about the soldiers, they would call them the invaders. I mean, you call them the soldiers. So even the word expedition was kind of was talked about sometimes in kind of brackets, like the Sullivan Expedition, like they really want to call it the Sullivan Invasion. So for people who are living in their homeland, to have these soldiers come in and burn everything is not something you'd celebrate. And you also wouldn't necessarily see it as a military expedition. You would see it sort of like whoa, these people just invaded our land or something. But everywhere I went, people were, there were some people very interested in the past, and there were always some people who really didn't care at all about the past at the same time. So I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, and as any good question and good answer should, it just just raises more questions and more thoughts.
Yeah.
So we're rapidly approaching 2026, which marks the 250th anniversary of the signing and implementation of the Declaration of Independence, and in the programming that that the nation is working towards in 2026 is shifting to focus more on the unheard and especially the underrepresented stories of everyday people in colonial America.
Yeah.
And a lot of the language that we use when we're talking about that is not that the stories are necessarily unheard, more that they are underrepresented because of who was writing that history and what they chose to record. So can you tell us how Memory Wars kind of fits into that broader discussion of inclusivity within historic sites and museums in particular?
Wow, that's a great question. Well, my book was definitely written with this sort of concern for inclusivity in mind, certainly, because what I'm doing is I'm trying to show how people, but I'm also trying to understand the reasons for the exclusivity in the past. So I'm trying to understand how it is that people in a country with settler colonial roots almost necessarily narrate their history in a distorted way. So it's almost hard not to. And so when you are looking at the same story from a Native perspective, everything shifts. So it's hard to even incorporate the Native perspective into a mainstream generic Revolutionary War history because everything is sort of opposite. So for instance, the Sullivan story, you find like in some small central New York town, the town history might start with the Sullivan Expedition, which is seen as the reason why white people are allowed to settle there. They destroyed the native town of whatever it was called. And then a few years later, we moved in. And then the history starts there and the town is established maybe a decade later. So the Sullivan story, the story of the town and the Sullivan story are connected, and it's a heroic story. And it's usually the town history is about 250 years old, as long as the revolution, as far as the revolution has been. But from the Haudenosaunee perspective, their history would start maybe 10,000 years ago. And so the settler story seems very, very short. Then they have this clear oral tradition of the founding of the Confederacy centuries before Sullivan. They'll talk about raids by the French in the 17th century. So Sullivan wasn't the first person to come along and raid or set up troops and to raid. There were other people who came and invaded. And then most people returned to the land after the Sullivan Expedition and were kicked out later on. Mm-hmm. And so then their stories will continue on. So they'll talk about being removed by state officials at a certain time. Then they'll talk about the throughway removals. So the Sullivan story is actually just a tiny part of a much longer history. So it's a completely different kind of orientation. Mm-hmm. And so it's not even necessarily framed as part of the Revolutionary War. It's more the Revolutionary War is part of this longer invasion by white people and attempt by white people to take land. And so it kind of shifts everything. So I'm trying to remember what you said. So there's, yes, inclusivity, but I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not that easy to just add another perspective on the Revolutionary War and keep the framework intact, because this other perspective kind of calls into question the entire framework that we use to understand the Revolutionary War. Mm-hmm. That I find really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it makes perfect sense too. And I know, like in Easton, we like to say that Easton was founded in 1752 as the halfway point between New York City and Philadelphia, right? But we tend to leave out the other half of that sentence of why it was chosen as the halfway point, because it was already a strategic point for the Lenape, who are still here, right? Yeah. And without telling that, we don't tell the complete story.
Yeah. And it's just so much a part of how we were brought up to narrate the past that it's sort of ingrained in how we see the world. Anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah. Oh no, you're fine. You're fine. I was just my next question has to do with Easton, so I was trying to segue in.
Okay.
The exploration of your work also connects us to Easton in that the markers begin in Easton, that the expedition, quote unquote, began in Easton. And you touched a little bit on it earlier, but I was wondering if you could go a little more in depth about how far north the markers go in particular, and again, how the story differs depending on the place that you're in that moment, like the marked shift between Pennsylvania and New York, or Southern New York as opposed to Northern New York. How do you see those differences?
Yeah, this was one of the biggest surprises for me. I really thought I would study a few markers in Pennsylvania and then study a few in New York, and my project would be done. But that was not the case. So the first markers were established by women who were members of early Pennsylvania chapters of the Daughters of the American Revolution. And the first markers were established by women in the Wyoming Valley. These markers tell a specific story. They position the Sullivan Expedition as revenge for what is called the Wyoming Massacre. So the Patriot losses at Wyoming were extensive. And so their history is basically a kind of two-part history. There was Wyoming, and then Sullivan was the response. So sort of cause and effect, they even say. You had Wyoming, so then you had Sullivan. And at dedication events, people talk about Wyoming and Sullivan kind of hand in hand. Not only that, the Wyoming battle is known as a massacre because there were Native American participants. And so at a lot of the events that are still going on today, the emphasis will be on Native American savagery. So the story is, kind of good riddance. Like Sullivan came along and saved the day, and, justice has been done. So the markers, there's a marker in Easton that was established in 1900 by a local chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, but the first one was established in 1896 by a woman on her own land, but she was a member eventually, and then more by chapters up and down the that area of Pennsylvania where many people who are descendants of massacre victims lived. So the women are kind of recognizing Wyoming by celebrating Sullivan. So that's what really they're doing there. In New York, the state got involved, but much later. So there wasn't the same kind of local emphasis on the Sullivan Expedition in New York until the 1920s. There was one big event for the centennial in 1879. And so that actually got people thinking about it for the first time. But before that time, people didn't even really know where the Sullivan Expedition had gone. They had to do a lot of research to figure out where the villagers had been and so forth. But the state really got involved in the 20s. And I was really interested in why the state was really gung-ho about celebrating the Sullivan Expedition then. And I found it was for the 150th anniversary. But there was also a major Six Nations land claim that was threatening the sovereignty of a lot of the state. So the front page of the New York Times said things like, the Six Nations claim, all of Buffalo. I mean, they were claiming Buffalo, Rochester, and a good third of the state. So the historical markers that are being developed at a time when this land claim is still in question. And what the markers say is a little bit different from the markers in Pennsylvania. They're really saying, it was Sullivan and Clinton who got this land for New York, and that's why we're here. And that's a kind of erroneous statement because people came back, and it was really later state officials and land speculators and other people that kicked Native people off the land again that got the land for New York. It wasn't necessarily Sullivan and Clinton, although they did destroy the villages for sure. And the Native Americans are even positioned differently. So in New York, they're not necessarily seen as savages, but sort of heroic but tragic figures who happen to bet on the wrong side of a conflict. So the markers start in Easton, and then there are a few over near Sunbury, where there was a Fort Augusta, but most of them go all the way up to Athens, Pennsylvania, and then cross into New York and go along the Finger Lakes. And they basically mark out where villages were that were destroyed. So, and I think, like I said, there are 35 big stone ones in New York. There are 22 big stone ones in Pennsylvania. Both sets set up for the 1929 commemorations. The Pennsylvania ones denote campsites because that's mostly what was happening. People were passing through. The New York ones denote Seneca and other villages for the most part. So I don't know if that's answering your question.
It does. I feel like every time you answer a question, there's more information that's just weighing like heavier on me every time.
Yeah. So New York and Pennsylvania tell different stories, even though it's the same expedition.
Yeah. Has there been an aspect of the researching and the writing of memory wars that has been particularly rewarding? Do you happen to like the research more, or the writing more, or like the exploration more?
It's all pretty fun. I love the research, but I think the most rewarding part are the friendships I've made over the course of this research. So some of the people that I interviewed, I now stay with when I'm on my way up through, and I've been working on several new projects with some of them as a result. So I think the most rewarding part are these relationships that have developed. I've gotten to know some people's family. I've met a lot of people who are really older, and so then I met their children. The challenge is there's just so much to tell. Limiting the book was the hardest part. Writing the book was fun, but there were no histories in the markers. I thought I would be interviewing people about the markers and then comparing that to the story, interviewing people about the past, comparing that to what's told on the markers, and then learning a little bit more about who put up the markers when and why from some book. But there were no books on the markers. So I had to write the marker history as well. And that's what's in the first part of the book. So yeah, all the different pieces I really enjoy.
Yeah. I know we didn't talk about it too much before, but can you talk about what like the structure of the book and how the book is set up? I know it's in three different parts. What
Oh,
does that
sure.
look like? Yeah.
Yeah. So the first part is called Origins, and I'm looking at the settler colonial public memory. And so I look at it gets even more complicated because there was a Yankee insurgency in northern Pennsylvania. So people from Connecticut were trying to hold on to part of Pennsylvania, and a lot of their ancestors, or a lot of their descendants, I'm sorry, were in the Battle of Wyoming. And a lot of the women in the DAR groups were Yankee dominated, were Connecticut descendants. So the first chapter, it's called, the first part of that section is called Pennsylvania in the Shadow of Wyoming. And I start with this sort of Yankee insurgency, the Battle of Wyoming, the patriotic women who were the descendants of these Yankees, and how they turned to celebrating Sullivan as a way to keep Wyoming in people's minds. And then I talk about the Pennsylvania Historical Commission's markers. So then the next part is about New York, and that's the origin of the markers in New York. So that's all of the origins, so the origins of the markers. Then the middle of the book is called Reverberations, and that's based on ethnographic research. So in that section, the subheading, it's called Reverberations, the Revolutionary Past in Contemporary America. So I look at how there are different kinds of celebrations even today that are related to the Revolutionary War. There is the annual commemoration of the Battle of Wyoming up near Wilkes-Barre every single year. That's a really huge, big, prominent event. And then I went to a couple years of the Battle of Newtown, which is a kind of reenactment of the one pitched battle of the Sullivan Expedition. And I look at how people in those two different sort of public events look at the past. And then I look at the different voices of people in Pennsylvania and how they talk about Sullivan today, and the different people in New York and how they talk about Sullivan today. And one of the things I found was that in New York, especially, there are a lot, well, in both states, there are people who are trying to fight back or write back to the narrative. And so they don't like the way the story's told on the markers. So what they're doing in both cases, there are two people who are writing novels for young adults that offer a different vantage on the Sullivan Expedition. And so I talked to these novelists. And then I found a group of people up in Syracuse who are trying to come up with new historical plaques. They aren't taking on a Sullivan plaque, but they took on a different plaque that was about the Haudenosaunee. And they came up with a new version, and they worked with the Onondaga Nation. They got people to tell them what was wrong with the existing plaque. They came up with new language, and this was a many-year project. And so I found those people really interesting. And some of the women in those organizations on a volunteer basis will go from town to town giving talks about historical markers just out of the goodness of their heart, just because they love to. And so that's all in that second section of the book. Then the last section of the book is where I look at how the Sullivan story is told at the Haudenosaunee cultural centers. And I put that last separate because I think, as I was mentioning, their version of the past is so different from the sort of standard American version of the Revolutionary past that if I tried to insert it, it would distort it. So I have them tell their story in their own section of the book. And that has a lot of interviews with the leaders of these cultural centers and what they think about historical markers in general, what they think about the American education system, what they think about how the Revolutionary War is taught, what they think about anti-Indian racism and how to combat it. And so they're really thoughtful and how they can use their cultural center to reach out to wider American society. So it's very reflective, thoughtful people. So I give them their own section in the last part of the book. So that's the structure. So it's called Origins, and then Reverberations, and then the Haudenosaunee Cultural Center I call Interventions, because they're kind of intervening in the dominant narrative. So
Hey, I just used the chat feature to include a link if anyone is interested in purchasing Memory Wars. You can tell this is some light reading. So make sure you set aside enough time to like really make sure that you are absorbing this information the way that it should be appreciated.
If you reach out to me, I can get you a discount coupon.
Oh,
Yeah, I
oh,
can give people a discount coupon. And in fact, if I can find it while we're still on I'll put it in the chat. There's like a code.
okay. Getting Dr. Smith's secrets here.
Yeah, no, I can give it to my colleagues and friends. So I think anybody who's interested in staying in on a Zoom conversation like this on a Thursday night in the middle of August is my friend. So I will look for that while we're talking.
Okay. While you look for that, could I ask also within the broader field of public history, not necessarily limited to your work in particular, but where are you hoping to see these conversations go, the directions that they may go in?
Well, there are a couple different things. I was thinking, well, you were saying that sometimes these conversations get really polarized.
Mhm.
And I think what is really interesting about public history and historical markers is trying to understand different mindsets at different times. And what's encouraging is how the current debates are getting people to take a look at some innocuous marker on the side of the road in a new way. And it's also getting them to look up some history in a new way and think about things in a new way. So even though sometimes the discussion seems to get unnecessarily polarized, it is getting people to discuss the past and what are we going to do about it, which I think is great.
Mhm.
With the Revolutionary War, I think people are starting to really rethink what it meant. I think in the past, it was always seen as a kind of unchallengeable period of time that we would all agree on. We know exactly who's on the good side and who's on the bad side. And we know it, it's kind of been simplified, and it's very kind of heroic and a patriotic story for sure.
Mhm.
But what that can do is simplify it in a way that makes it less interesting. And now people are starting to think, oh, wait a minute, what was it like for the Loyalists and where did they go? And, and especially in New York, where you have descendant communities on both sides of the Sullivan Expedition, people are really challenged with what to do about commemorating that in the 250th anniversary. So I think I'm hoping the conversation will continue to stay open and for people not to get foreclosed or, sort of entrenched in positions, but to also think about how altering a story or opening up the narrative is challenging, and it takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of conversation. So I think that's where I'm hoping things will go in the future.
Yes, you and I both. I know in particular, we are as a museum, as a historical society, part of our mission statement is that we try to be, as inclusive and to foster respectful communities and more caring communities. And at the same time, we have to understand that if we're looking at history and we are comfortable with what we are seeing, we're not studying history. History it's ugly, it's confusing, it's complicated. It's not going to make you comfortable. But we do the past an injustice, and I think we do the future an injustice when we don't have those conversations.
Yeah, that's well put. Absolutely.
So we talked a little bit about the preparations for the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence that is coming very quickly in 2026. We are already halfway through 2023. Sorry for that reminder if you didn't want to hear that today, everyone. But a number of historical, cultural, and educational institutions around the Lehigh Valley are commemorating, maybe commemorating is not the best word, acknowledging this event and inviting us to explore these different perspectives, to ask the hard questions and to listen to those, especially who have had their stories silenced by the people that we look up to in history. And tonight's is one of the many programs to come that is exploring these narratives. And of course, we encourage all of you here tonight and those who will watch it and share this program when it does go up on YouTube, to keep having these conversations, to keep in touch with us, to keep in touch with these kinds of works and the authors and the historians and the researchers, and especially just the folks on the ground level who are doing this hard and complicated work and trying to begin those kinds of discussions at a time when having these discussions feels more and more alarmingly relevant. So just a reminder, I did include a link to purchase Dr. Smith's new book from the University of Nebraska Press. It is called Memory Wars. Dr. Smith, Andrea, I cannot thank you enough for being here tonight. Anything that you would like to add on before we move into some questions?
I feel like I could talk a little bit too long, but just how it's really fun to talk about this project. And I guess when you were talking about the new upcoming anniversary, it's nice to see that this topic is not so arcane. I felt for a while I was studying something kind of bizarre and who would ever care, but now that the anniversary is coming up, people are really thinking and talking about different aspects of the Revolutionary War, and it's really gratifying and fun. But thank you for these really thought-provoking questions.
Thank you for the thought-provoking answers.
Yeah, sure.
All right, we have a question from Tom. I'm just going to read the whole thing out for the sake of it. Many thanks for your interesting presentation. I admire your dogged pursuit of overlooked and distorted history. On your travels to history centers, have you found many land acknowledgements? And if so, do they include the history that you have uncovered?
That's a great question. Not all. I think there are more land acknowledgements in New York, and sometimes they're kind of hidden. I'm trying to think. I don't remember seeing some. When I would go to historical societies, I wouldn't necessarily see something. But on the other hand, most historical societies would have a whole collection of Native American artifacts, so they would have a narration of the people who lived there before already kind of built in. So I have not seen that many. And the full version of the Sullivan Expedition, it really depends on where you are. In Pennsylvania, it's not really a central focus because I think most of the Haudenosaunee nations are in New York, and so they don't have much of a voice in Pennsylvania. So the other side of the story is not as easy to access. So does that answer your question, Tom? Hopefully.
Yep. Here's a question from Kevin. The narrative of Revolutionary War historians typically group all Native peoples into a single entity when they describe Native attacks on white settlements. I've read many accounts of the Sullivan Expedition. You are the first person I've heard that notes that not all Native people were united in these attacks. Can you talk more about the leadership of these tribes and the percentage of Native peoples and tribes that may have supported or engaged in these frontier attacks? Can you talk more about Native leadership, government, and unity?
Oh boy. So it all depends on which attacks you're talking about. I think at Wyoming, there are probably 150 different Native people, and I couldn't list them all. So there was corn planters, a very famous Seneca leader who I'm pretty sure was there. There was a series of people who people thought were there, like Joseph Brant, who was a Mohawk, who are not. I don't have off the top of my head the percentage of people that engaged in the frontier attacks. I think in any community, though, what I've read is there was often, what people have said, sort of in general terms about the Revolutionary War, the division between the Patriots and the British was kind of the schism in populations was reproduced oftentimes within every single Native American tribe. So there were always people who wanted to be on one side or the other. And it was always a great deal of tension to hold the tribe together. And so there were always some warriors who wanted to fight with the British, and then some people who wanted to stay the course, some people wanted to be neutral. And so I think there was never a whole unity. Even the Seneca, there were people who were more focused on neutrality, and some Seneca went out west. But I don't have the percentages, I'm sorry, off the top of my head. But I would just say that when you get into the history of even one group, like you were saying, Kevin, say you were looking at the history of the Mohawks, some Mohawks revered Joseph Brant, a lot of them did not. And so one leader might have many different perspectives. And so today, if you go to different Mohawk nations, there are many different territories where Mohawks are living, you'll find very different views on one person. And so they're very heterogeneous communities. Yeah.
Tom also asks, some markers that I've seen refer to Sullivan's March. Why is it March? And
that's a good question.
Why are some March and some expedition?
Yeah, I think from the perspective of people living nearby, that's what was happening. There were soldiers marching by. Yeah, I think, and that's how it was known colloquially in certain regions. In New York, it's referred to as the Sullivan and Clinton campaign. So they don't call it the Sullivan Expedition. They add Clinton in. Now, Clinton was a relative of the first governor of New York. So it makes it more of a New York kind of centered, even though the major general, the generals that were in charge of the different units were from multiple states. So it's kind of a multi-state expedition. In New York, it becomes a kind of New York centered event because Sullivan and Clinton, the General Clinton, who is the other general, are positioned side by side on the markers. And it's called the Sullivan Clinton campaign. And if you go to New York, people will correct you. But in Pennsylvania, it's often called Sullivan's Expedition. But I've heard people say, well, in Sullivan's March, they marched up here and, they got rid of the Indians or something like that. So that's how it's known colloquially. And I'm not sure if there's any other explanation for that.
Yeah. Tim is really asking the $1 million question here. It seems like even the idea of putting up markers in this way is such a colonial act in and of itself, marking what and where and how. What do you think historians, public historians, museum folks can do today and leading up to 2026 and beyond, not to continue doing that kind of violence against the people of the past and the people of today? How can we work to fix it?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, that's basically what I'm arguing in the book. I'm saying people coming into a new land really need some way to make that land their home. And one of the ways to do that is to narrate their past right on the land and make it seem like they've been there forever. And so you could say that a lot of our historical markers, not even just the ones to the Sullivan Expedition, are ways to grapple with home loss. I mean, this is where home loss features in this book, but in sort of an indirect way. I'm saying that people in this country who are the settlers are all from somewhere else, and they've all left their homes, and they're trying to make their home in a new place. And how do they do that? And how do they feel connected and have a sense of belonging in a place that they've known, as one person said, one scholar says, that they've come to in violence? So how do you grapple with that experience as a settler? And one of the things you do is you start to narrate your past and write about the first house, the first town, the first, as if there were no other people here before. And you're kind of pinning yourself to the land. So I do think that marking the land in this way is kind of a colonial act, as you're saying. How do we not do that kind of violence? I think just asking this question is getting people to think about this. Like, why are we marking? Do we need this marker? Do we need more markers? In New York, there was an attempt to put new markers up to the Sullivan Clinton Expedition. And then a lot of people are saying, wait a minute, I don't know if we want to keep celebrating this. And so the question is, well, then what do you do? Could you have some kind of an event? Could you do something different than putting up historical markers? Could you have some kind of art show around the marker, or some kind of, some people are talking about, in New York, they're talking now actively, and it'd be I'd love to get involved with people about this in Pennsylvania too. If anybody's interested, please reach out to me. In New York, there's a team of people, and they're thinking about coming up with some kind of app where you would go past a marker and then it would tell the story from a different vantage point.
Oh,
And so then as you're driving, your phone would ping or something, and then you would, I don't know if you're supposed to look at the images or you wait till the next day or something. But you could do something like that to try to get people to think about other vantage points. Yeah.
yeah. Bet you guys didn't think that you'd be articulating the process of decolonization at 7 p.m. on a Thursday night. Huh?
Yeah. I can see Richard's question here. Should I answer it? The one about
Go for it.
From what I remember, Clinton County may be named after Governor Clinton, and Sullivan County, I think, is not named after Sullivan. I think it's named after a different Sullivan. I can check that and get back to you, but I remember thinking that it was and finding out that it wasn't. So there's a different Sullivan, but there are Sullivan roads in New York as well. So Sullivan Road, Sullivan Trail, definitely named after the Sullivan Expedition.
I'm going to take up Tom's latest question. He says, markers for the walking purchase are just another example of our ancestors' perspectives on history. Probably another topic, but would like to hear about the Sickle Museum's approach to these events. I myself can't speak like on a perspective on this events, but I can say what the museum is doing from our perspective to be more inclusive and to uplifting these stories is that just before the COVID-19 pandemic, we opened up an exhibit called Destination Northampton County. And part of the purpose of that exhibit was so that anyone from anywhere in Northampton County could feel like they had a place here. And that speaks to a lot of the memory and the shared communal memory and collective memory. But part of also what we were hoping to do with that exhibit and throughout the museum as a whole was to center the underrepresented stories of the folks who call Northampton County home. And part of our first floor permanent exhibit is a great place to start for folks who have not been to the museum. That's where I recommend that they start first, is walking straight into the first floor chronological part of the museum and beginning with the story of the Lenape. And that particular part of the exhibit was all done in participation with the Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania. It is all their artifacts, their stories, their words. And I think the very least that museums can do as traditional institutions of power that, let's face it, have historically been run by white men, the very least that we can do is to make sure that we are giving those stories a place where they can be told. And at the same time, understanding that we are in that privileged position to be able to give that story a home in the first place. But that's a much bigger conversation than we can have at 7 p.m. On a Thursday evening conversation. But I think that as an institution and as employees of that institution, we have a duty to serve the community. And that means the whole community, not just one story of the community.
Mm-hmm. My next project's on the walking purchase marker. So I've started delving into those, and it's a wacky story about 3 white guys who are all trying to narrate local history. And then one guy wins out when the other guys turn their back and puts those markers up. So it's a really kind of crazy random story. But yeah, I think that's exactly a related topic. Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Howie says we also did the healing walk with the Bachman players in the Lenape. We did. And I've heard that there are plans to do that again in the future. I can't make promises, but if it is possible, I definitely would recommend connecting with the folks who do that, because again, that is the opportunity to listen to the voices of people who are impacted by the particular narratives of the stories that we tell and stories that we highlight. Anyone else have any other questions before we wrap up? I will say again too, if you missed in the introduction that this program is being recorded, it will be uploaded onto the NCHGS YouTube page, hopefully within the next week and a half, 2 weeks at the very most, depending on how my technology cooperates. But I'll have your email, so I will make sure to send everyone a link to the recording once it is up and published. I also do make sure that everything is closed captioned for accessibility.
I just found my code.
Oh, yay.
So I just
Get
remember
us a book deal.
Yeah, and it should be code. If it doesn't work, please reach out to me at smithaL@lafayette.edu. I'll put my email. Can you guys all get the chat? I don't know if everybody can do this, but you put in that code, you should get 40% off.
Oh.
And anybody can't, if it doesn't work, just email me and I'll figure out a way. So what you do is you go to University of Nebraska Press, if you're buying it from their website, and then you put in the code 6S23.
All right.
So 6AS23. You know, I do think the book is way too pricey, and it's going to come out in paper at some point, but I don't know how soon I can get them to do that. But that's the price. That's the 6AS23, and I'm at smithaL@lafayette.edu.
All right. And this is also where I shamelessly plug that you can request it from your local library.
Oh, yes.
Yes, you said Lafayette does have a copy.
Absolutely. And I'm going to get some copies to a lot of different libraries. So.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, I should drop one off at Easton for sure.
Okay. All right, perfect. All right, if we don't have any other more questions, I want to thank everyone again for coming out. I hope you are all doing well in that torrential downpour that we just had. And it was difficult to find an area of the museum that didn't sound like the rain was going to come through the roof. But I encourage everyone to check out Memory Wars, to visit sigelmuseum.org to see all of our upcoming programs and events. Again, as I said, this is only one of the many programs that we'll be gearing up for 2026. To find more information on our membership, I will also include our website, if I can talk and type at the same time and spell museum correctly.
And I should say that somebody who's featured in the book is in the audience. So,
oh.
Yeah, somebody who's interviewed. So I want to thank him. I don't know if he wants to be named by name, but
well, you know who
his first name is Jack. Great to see you.
All right, thank you again to everyone so much. I will stop the recording now. And again, as I said, I will let you all know when it is up on the YouTube page.
Thank you very much. This is a really great idea.
Right, thanks so much, everyone.
Take care. Have a good night, everybody. Bye.